There's a story, I don't know if it's true, where Brent Scowcroft once was asked to introduce Henry Kissinger. And he basically said, tonight we clearly have someone speaking here who clearly needs no introduction. And he stopped and he said, but Henry would like one anyway. And I don't know if it's true or not, but it ought to be. And I also think that it's great to be here. Whenever I speak in front of an organization, particularly this one, it's a little bit like Macy's and Gimbel's doing business together. So I'm not sure who's Macy's and who's Gimbel's, but it's good to be here. And you all do, I think, a great deal of important work. So as the guy who runs the place down the street, I salute what the Foreign Policy Association continually does. You really are an important source of education in the most fundamental sense for this country about foreign policy at a time we need all the education we can get about foreign policy. What I thought I'd do is outline some of the ideas that I've been wrestling with over the last couple of years and that I put pen to paper with in this book, and then I won't go on too long. You will not get my Fidel Castro filibuster speech tonight, and that will save the bulk of the time we've got for you all. I call this book The Opportunity, despite the fact that when you pick up the New York Times or, I suppose, watch morning television, though in the case of morning television now you don't get any news, but when you do pick up the newspaper where you still do get news, there's an awful lot of bad news. And if one takes a quick look at the world, I don't know about you all, but I can't think of another time in the last few decades or even longer when there were so many challenges at once filling the foreign policy plate. Even just a quick hopscotch around, whether it's terrorism, or the Iran or North Korean nuclear challenges, or what's going on now in the Middle East with the Hamas victory, questions about whether we're going to have a new trade agreement, global climate issues, the possibility of pandemic flu, the reality of HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, 1/3 of the world's people living on $2 a day. I could go on, but you get the idea. The people in my business are not lacking for challenges or way to spend their time. Still, as difficult as it is some days, I'm still fundamentally an optimist, not because I'm congenitally optimistic. Those of you in this room who know me know that I'm not congenitally optimistic. Yet I still believe there's an interesting chance now for some possibility. And the reason is that we are at a moment of history which has the reality about it and the potential to constitute a fundamental departure. And let me just bear with me for a second. Let me just work through it. The modern world, the modern state system, goes back about 350 years, since the end of the then 30 Years' War in Europe and the Treaty of Westphalia. And since that time, the world has had various great powers, whether the French or Germans or British in Europe, at times Japan, and others. What's interesting, though, is that when the history of this period is written, and it has been written often, the principal dynamic in this period of now better than 3 centuries has been great power competition and conflict. I mean, take the last century. You had 2 world wars and a Cold War. And those were, in some ways, the dominant geopolitical events of the century. What's so interesting now is that whatever else you can say about this world, and all the challenges in this world notwithstanding, the one thing you don't have to worry about if you're the President of the United States when you get up in the morning and you put on your sneakers, the one thing you don't have to worry about is great power competition and leading to conflict. If you look at U.S. relations with India, with China, with Japan, with Russia, with Europe, what have you, we don't agree on everything, but the ceiling is clearly there on disagreements. The prospects for great power, serious great power competition or conflict, I think, are remote. And that represents a fundamental departure in history. And to kind of get ahead of myself, the goal of American foreign policy ought to be to lock that in, to transform what is essentially a departure or a respite into something lasting. And the obvious reasons are that, one, it's good, and second of all, it liberates us. The fact that we don't have to devote the bulk of our resources, the bulk of our energies, the bulk of our time, in some ways the most precious resource of all for a policymaker, to worrying about this means we can devote our resources to worrying about everything else, which God knows deserves our worrying about it. So this is the fundamental, I think, departure of our time and the fundamental reason for this opportunity. The interesting question then is why? Why now? Why is it that great powers seem to have broken with their historical pattern? Why does this represent what I think, to use Thomas Kuhn's phraseology, a paradigm shift in international politics, in international relations? And I think there's two reasons. And they're important because our ability to sustain these two reasons will be central to our ability to make this respite from history lasting. And our failure to sustain these two reasons will mean it will come to an end. The first reason is U.S. power. U.S. power gives the United States, all aspects of power, not just military, but U.S. power gives the United States capacity to act and all that. But also U.S. power discourages great power competition and conflict. To put it another way, if you're another great power and you wake up in the morning, it would be a fool's errand to decide to take the United States on, given the disparity in strength. At some point, inequality discourages contest. And the fact that the United States is fundamentally so much more powerful than the others means that it's not a particularly attractive strategy for another country to take the United States on. Perhaps even more important, the reason the great power conflict is so remote, is that a lot of what the United States is doing in the world, or trying to do, is essentially acceptable to others. Or to use my sneaker analogy, when people who run the other countries in the world, when they get up in the morning and lace on their sneakers, it's globalization, so everybody wears the same sneakers. When they do that, they don't worry about a lot of what the United States is doing. Because when they look at U.S. goals, stopping the spread of nuclear weapons, or stopping terrorism, or promoting free trade, or doing something about stopping drugs, or what have you, they don't see these U.S. goals as somehow aimed at them. They don't worry that the U.S. might succeed. To the contrary. In many of these cases, they hope the U.S. might succeed because if it would also be good for them. There's nothing that's narrowly or selfishly American or pro-American about most of what the United States is trying to do in the world. And even when they disagree with us, say with Iraq, again, they don't see it as aimed at them. They just think the United States is unwise or wrong. But there's very little about what we're trying to do that they wake up in the morning and say they've got to stop us. There's a tolerance, if you will, of American power. So this combination of American strength and tolerance of it makes great power conflict and even competition quite remote, and frees up the United States and others to do some useful things with their capacities. But opportunity is not inevitability. That's what I've learned in life. And this period of history will not be sustained unless certain things are avoided and unless certain things happen. Let me start on the negative side. What needs to be avoided by the United States? Let me suggest three things. First, the United States needs to avoid unilateralism. It is simply not a viable strategy to act alone in this world, in part because however great American resources are, they're not unlimited. And secondly, the nature of the problems we do face, again, nuclear spread, terrorism, global climate change, setting up an open world economy, there's nothing about these problems that lend themselves to a solution by one country acting alone. What we've learned the hard way is if there's countries that aren't participating, those holes in the net will become the entry points, whether it's for those who traffic in slavery, or those who traffic in drugs, or those who traffic in terror, or those who traffic in nuclear weapons. So we need collective efforts if we are going to succeed in dealing with the characteristic problems of the day. Secondly, we need to show some discretion in what we do. That the United States cannot do everything in the world. Again, however great America's resources are, they are not unlimited, and if we try to do too much, we will spend down our resources, and if we do that, again, we will then create circumstances where others might find it attractive to challenge us. One of the reasons that I had questions about the wisdom about Iraq, a war that I described as a war of choice, was my concern that this discretionary use of American resources was exactly the sort of discretionary activity the United States needed to resist. That we couldn't sustain Iraq's and also sustain our strength or our advantages in the world. Thirdly, though, the United States needs to avoid the other extreme. If we need to avoid trying to do it all by ourselves, and secondly, if we need to avoid trying to do too much, if you will, too much ambition, we also need to avoid trying to do too little. Isolationism is not an option. Put another way, we can't become a gated country. One can go on with this, but the idea is there's no hiding from globalization. No country can make its borders impervious. We can't make ourselves impervious to people we may want to keep out or germs. We can't also live without our borders being open so we can get stuff going in the other direction, whether it's trade or investment. We need to interact with the world. We unavoidably act with the world. Globalization is not a policy option. Globalization is a reality. The challenge for policymakers is to figure out how to respond to globalization. And the response of isolation, of running away from it, is no response. In the proverbial sense, and in the basic sense, you can run but you can't hide from it. It will find you. And the malign aspects, the dark aspects of globalization will find the United States. We can't, again, wall ourselves off from them. But let me be a little bit more positive. If we need to avoid acting alone or doing too much or doing too little, what then should the United States do in the world? I would suggest that what the United States needs to do is, to use my favorite word, integrate with others to essentially tackle what are the defining global problems of the day. By integration, I mean a couple of things. One is to bring in the other major powers as partners, to basically get the Chinas of the world to help us deal with, say, the North Korean nuclear problem, or the Russias of the world to help us deal with the Iranian nuclear challenge, or all of them to sign up to a new world trading agreement, to essentially make them partners, not as a favor to us, but as a favor to themselves, to bring them around to the point of view where in many instances they will see that their own self-interest is not all that far from our own. Secondly, where we can, to build some new rules, to build new institutions. It was very creative after World War II. And the question is, might we not be equally creative now in building new arrangements to deal with the challenges of this era? After World War II, most institutions were built around serving Western interests in a Cold War. What we need are new arrangements to serve our interests in this world. Thirdly, we've got to find a way to bring in the 2 billion people, 1 out of every 3 people, who aren't integrated in the world, who are missing out. They're missing out economically, they're missing out in many cases politically. And the question is, how does one bring them in? It's good for moral reasons, but it's also good for economic and strategic reasons if they participate fully in the world. And then